Good evening, Liberty.meers and all interested parties. I think I'll wait just a few minutes for everybody to get kind of caught up here. And the other thing is that I will be trying to follow Q&A as we go along here on the website. So if you log into Liberty.me, you'll be able to chat with me on this. And I would like to chat, actually, because there's a lot of issues going on here with this book and with what we're going to be discussing tonight. So I would love the chance to talk with you about it. Let's see what's going on in chat here. Hold on. Here we go. Okay. All right. All right. Anybody want to test the chat to make sure we're all working? It seems like we're in the summer doldrums here. Lower attendance than you might than I usually expect on Sunday nights. Of course, I've been away for a couple of weeks too, so I hate to break the pattern. In any case, yeah. So I'll try to follow the chat. If anybody has any questions or comments, then you can just get on and let me know. Okay, so our book tonight. Ooh, did anybody hear that? Did you hear that? I'm hearing that. Okay, let me see if I can do about turning that down. Test. Thank you. Let me just turn that off. Good. Okay, everybody's here. This is good. All right, let's do this thing. So the book is by Murray Rothbard, Freedom, Inequality, Primitivism, and the Division of Labor. It's not quite a book, right? It's just an extended essay, really. But it's cool because he's dealing with like all these central questions that involve economics, political philosophy, and yeah, economics, political philosophy, social organization, and ethics. So he kind of maps out in this book his sort of canonical Rothbardian position. And I'll tell you how this essay came about. It's fascinating to me because I think the original edition was written in something like 1971. And so far as I know, he was on his, he had just been through probably 5 or 6 years, maybe 7 years or longer of a sort of dalliance on the new left. You know, if you know something about Rothbard's history, you know, he began as just a regular neoclassical economist who was very interested in just J.B. Say and the work of the early Austrians. His father was a bit of a right-winger, so he had a lack of interest in Keynesian economics. But then, while he was in New York, he got very personally involved with the world of Ayn Rand, right? Who was just this literary sensation after The Fountainhead came out. And he entered into her world and read her, drank deeply from the objectivist well, I guess you could say, or at least it wasn't called objectivist in those days. It was Randian world, and he was deeply involved in that. And then at some point, sort of lost interest just because it didn't. You know, there are many things about it, I think, in those days that sort of troubled him a little bit. Rothbard is more interested in libertarianism as opposed to, you know, the philosophy of ethical egoism and all the things that Rand was interested in. So he went off and started his own group, very much in opposition to the rise of the National Review conservatives. And this is probably partly of what led to Rothbard's first distancing himself from Randianism, or from Rand, was the problem of the Cold War. I mean, it's very difficult for us in 2015 to fully understand the importance of the Cold War in those days. I mean, it was everything. You know, after 1948, especially after 1952, for the American right wing, it was the single most important, most pressing matter was to favor U.S. nuclear buildup to confront the alleged, danger of Russia. And Rothbard was never with that position. I think he resisted this partly, I think primarily under the influence of Frank Chodorow. Frank Chodorow was in many ways his mentor. I would say in these days he had basically two big mentors. It was Ayn Rand, who informed his outlook on ethics and ethics and philosophy, natural rights theory, and that sort of thing. But then on politics, it was all about Frank Chodorow. He was the guy. And Frank Chodorow was basically an anarchist who hated the Cold Warriors and came out of that old right anti-militarist tradition. So this is probably more than anything else what led to Rothbard's break with Rand, initial break with Rand. It wasn't so much a break as it was a lack of interest. And forming his own little circle Bastian, modeled basically on Rand's collective. By the way, of course, on economic matters, this entire time he's studying under Ludwig not so much studying under Ludwig von Mises, but primarily under the influence of the Misesian sort of twist and turn is improvement on classical economic theory. So. So he had already written his Man, Economy, and State, which is more or less a sort of a commentary on human action that clarified some aspects of Misesian style Austrian theory, and Rothbard was felt personally very isolated and alienated from the National Review crowd. National Review had been founded, I believe I'm trying to think about this here. I think it might have been in the 1950. Yeah, I'm sorry, you can look it up, the founding of National Review. I think it must have been the mid-1950s or something like that. Basically as a CIA organ to draw the old right libertarianism, into support for the Cold War. Well, Rothbard would have none of it. He wrote for National Review for a little while, but after a while he began to believe that the right represented in many ways a greater threat to human liberty even than the left. After all, there was no threat of socialism coming to America. Despite all the red baiting that was going on, the real threat to American liberty has always been fascism and right-wing, theocratic militarization, militarized, brown shirt theory coming under the guise of freedom, namely from the Republicans and the National Review crowd. Rothbard was personally horrified that free enterprise and the free markets and the cause of liberty that he believed in so strongly would have been at all linked with the right. Out of this period comes the great essay that he co-authored with Leonard Liggio called Left, Right, and the Prospects for Liberty, in which he, attempts to re-render the cause of liberty as being basically a left-wing cause. It's a complicated argument, and also the belief that the enemies of liberty have always come from the ideological right. Of course, these terms are so malleable, right? And they change from country to country from time to time. So it's difficult to talk about it in these kinds of terms, but Rothbard did. He wanted to talk about the left, right, and the prospects for liberty. He re-rendered intellectual history as the right has always been the enemy of liberty. The left has always been the champion of liberty, resisting ecclesiocracy, theocracy, hierarchy, the ruling class controlled, where the government and the primary landowners ran the regime. The left has always been, against that, pushing for the rights of average people against the ruling class elites. So that was an essay that came out, I believe it was in 1967, 1968, something like that. Left, Right, and the Prospects for Liberty. If you haven't read it, it's one of the most mind-blowing essays you'll ever read. It's really quite an interesting thing. But I think, this essay we're looking at tonight, Freedom, Inequality, Primitivism, the Division of Labor, really comes out of a kind of period in which he's I would say he's sort of very, I wouldn't say disillusioned, because, you know, to say somebody's disillusioned implies that they were illusioned. You know, I don't think Rothbard was ever illusioned when he joined Students for the Democratic Society, or at least you know took up the cause. I mean, it's pretty funny to think all these years Ms. Rothbard felt a greater sense of symbiotic relationship with the left than with the right. It's almost impossible for us to imagine this because we weren't there, and the Cold War is so forgotten. But you know, when the right wing consists of basically people that are lustily longing for dropping nuclear bombs on Moscow, and then otherwise imposing a theocratic Franco style Spanish fascism on America. Yeah, I mean, you start to get drawn to things like the anti-draft people. They seemed a little more correct. The free speech movement, civil rights movement, all this stuff seems a little more reasonable than the Buckleyite longing for instant nuclear war. So you kind of get why he might have had some sympathies for the left, but he spent a lot of time hanging around the left. And I mean, this, Rothbard actually was on the streets, which is what caused Bill Buckley to purge him, completely from National Review. When Khrushchev came to America, and I want to say that was, I'm a little confused on my dates. I seem to remember that was like 1957. I don't know how that could be true, because I think Buckley didn't purge Rothbard until maybe 10 years later or something like that. But maybe Rothbard is just dragging up old information, but Murray was on the streets, cheering him on, along with the Communist Party and Students for Democratic Society and the far left in general. So yeah, Rothbard was right there, So that's basically what Murray wanted was not communism, he just wanted peace. I mean, that was the whole thing. But I mean, for the American right, I mean, it's the ultimate heresy to be out on the street, cheering the Soviet premier as he's going by in his motorcade. So so Murray was kicked out of the right. I spent a lot of time dealing with the left, and I think he came away with a quite an interesting education in what is the core intellectual problem with this particular thing we call American leftism, as it stood in, say, 1968, 1969, and probably as it still stands today. And so this is Rothbard's truth-telling essay. He's like, I've been there, I've done that, I know these people, they don't get economics, they have a screwed up sense of reality. They don't understand, the state of nature, what really fundamentally threatens humankind, and the way to get out of the state of nature into civilization. They don't get any of this. So this is sort of his tutorial. I like to think when I read this essay that it's a bit of it's Rothbard's lesson to the left. It's like, if you want to improve your worldview, don't get rid of your affection for free speech. Don't get rid of your affection for civil liberties. Don't get rid of your anti-war stance. Don't get rid of your presumed love of the masses as versus elites. All that stuff's great, but you do need to learn something about property rights, about the origin of society, about the state of nature, about the contribution of capitalism, trade, and ownership to building a better life. So this is Rothbard's, in a sense, it's his rebuke to the left. And there really are, I would say, 4 parts to his argument here. And they're summed up in the title, freedom, inequality, primitivism, and the division of labor. So what he does is he marches, and it's a brilliant presentation, because he and I have to say this essay sort of forms my own understanding of what we're dealing with here. When we talk about the social, political, economic problem, what are we dealing with? Essentially, it comes down to this: we're dealing with the problem of privation. I mean, humankind comes into a world. Think back as far as you want. However it's going to be. 500,000 years. Whatever it's going to be. We are born into a world of nothing. Certain things are naturally given to us, things that grow on trees, slow-moving animals, that sort of thing. But essentially, we have nothing. We have short lives, just like Hobbes said, that are filled with danger, and we're tasked with building civilization. So Rothbard asks, how does this happen? The fundamental thing is of course, freedom. Without freedom to act, there can be no innovation. There can be no, association, no innovations of tools, and property rights. That we have to eventually develop property rights. Without property rights, we can't domesticate animals. Without domesticating animals and keeping them secure to ourselves, we can't eat. Without property rights, there can be no agriculture and raising of plants and raising of food. So property rights and freedom are foundational to taking the first steps out of the state of nature. Without that, we have nothing. And it's very strange, actually, that these two institutions of economic freedom and private property are two things that the left seems never to quite get, can't ever quite come to terms with it. The socialist vision is essentially a vision of a world in which everything is given to us in a massive bounty. And then it all becomes a matter of dividing it up. I mean, if you read any of the encyclicals for the latest pope, or actually, many before him, this is the world you get. I mean, it's this presumption that wealth is just something we deserve, that was brought to us, I don't know what, by God, I don't know. But Rothbard's point is no, all wealth you see around you has been created. It's been created out of a system of freedom and an order of property rights, without which we are all, essentially starving and dead. True. Okay, now the second part of the left that he really has a serious problem with is the issue of equality and hierarchy. And I would like to talk about this just a little bit. But there's some very funny passages in here in which Rothbard talks about what is the left's obsession with consensus as essential to a decision-making process. So this seems to have been born of a lot of meetings in basements, with the Students for Democratic Society, or God knows where he was. The left's obsession with getting consensus and resentment against any forms of leadership. Rothbard says in here that it leads to massive time wasting, because to get consensus on everything, on every single decision you could ever imagine, is essentially impossible and comes at the expense of people's time. It's just a terrible thing. It always reminds me of the movie Reds, and all my favorite people have seen Reds and love this movie. I love it, but just the amount of time that they spend in sweaty basements, screaming at each other over the bylaws, is pretty funny. You can just imagine what it must be like to live in that world where every decision is a political decision. No decisions are purely economic, right? This is what happens when you don't understand economics. You transfer all the important decisions over every aspect of life. How many coats should there be? How many resources should go into bow ties versus wool pants? What kind of cars should people drive? How long can people? How far should the average person be permitted to drive? So every decision in life becomes a political decision, and everything has to be solved by consensus. Since property rights and free trade and free association are not the thing that makes the world tick, according to this view, Everything has to come out of politics. It's very much like an ancient view of what constitutes real freedom, which is political engagement. So the left is consumed with this sort of hyper-politicization of society. So Rothbard really takes this on and argues for what he calls the iron law of oligarchy. Essentially, Rothbard once is lecturing the left here and explaining to people there is no getting rid of hierarchy. Oligarchy, leadership, the fact that some bear responsibility for decision making and that others are hired to follow those decisions. To Rothbard, this is just an outgrowth of natural human association. And I get this. You know, the more passionate you are about something, the greater the chance you're going to end up in a leadership position. And that's the iron law of our oligarchy, that there'll always be in every sphere of life, whether it's a church or a civic organization or a business or even a political activist group, there'll always be a group that you can call leaders. There's no such thing as pure democratic rule over all of life. There'll always be an elite. So Rothbard's point is that we have two choices. We can empower this elite with guns and violence and call them the state and pretend like they should be a permanent feature of the world with massive knowledge and massive power to impose their perspective on the world, regardless of whether it succeeds or not. Or we can make this elite a private elite that emerges from a market that's always being subject to a test. If you succeed, you persist, but if you fail, you'll be overthrown. So to Rothbard, there's no question that you're going to have leadership in society. It's just a question of whether or not this leadership grows out of a voluntary order or is imposed by a political system. So I think it's interesting. So it's the iron law of oligarchy. It defends essentially hierarchy, leadership principle, the existence of rulers and followers, but wants it all embedded within a market context, not within a political structure that is implacable. So there's that. The second thing he takes on here, or I guess now we're talking about the third thing, is this issue of equality. And here he speaks very much, along the lines of what you're going to get out of Liberty.me, which is a defense of inequality as being integral to individualism. Now, you think this might be controversial because today to speak about the inherent inequality of all people is, presumably slightly politically correct, perhaps, or sort of dabbling dangerously with forbidden topics. But it's actually ridiculous. I was just reading an essay by Ludwig von Mises today called "The Status of the Elites Under Capitalism." It came out in the Freeman in January 1962. And no doubt that Mises, that Rothbard would have read this essay. It's a very good essay. But what's fascinating to me, it's the only time I've ever seen Mises quote Marx favorably. And what he quotes him as saying is that inequality is an inherent feature of humanity. And he actually quotes Marx as saying that. I guess Mises read everything by Marx. He quotes Marx as saying, without inequality, we would have no conception of individualism at all. That's, with individualism, we're all unique. That means we're not the same. If you think about equality as being sameness, Marx and Mises, Rothbard are certainly right here. Now, Rothbard goes further, of course, to discuss a kind of equality that he thinks libertarians should embrace, which is a sort of an equality of liberty, that we're all should be regarded the same under the laws under which we live. Just, you know, that he wants to, he believes in this. I like this phrase, equality of freedom, you know, rather than equality of result or equality of opportunity or the rest of these things. By the way, I've seen too many people, even in recent days, try to rally around the term equality of result, or sorry, equality of opportunity as opposed to equality of result. That doesn't really work. So for any libertarians who are listening, please understand that opportunity and result are just really the same idea, just different points in the time spectrum, you know? An opportunity is a result of previous things. A result is just the, fulfillment of previous opportunities. I mean, there's not the big difference that you might think between the two terms. To achieve equality of opportunity would be as ghastly and unachievable as equality of result. It makes no sense. There's no conceivable way in which you can think that a child born to an upper middle class in Vancouver, Canada, has exactly the same opportunities as somebody born in the to a sharecropper in the Black Belt of Alabama. There's no way you can conceive of that. The attempt to bring about equality of opportunity would just be just as damaging to human liberty and human property as any attempt to impose an equality result. So, and Rothbard would like to replace both terms with just a very simple concept of equality of freedom. Equality of freedom is an idea, of course, drawn from Herbert Spencer, who proposed a law of equal freedom, which is that you can do whatever you want as long as you don't interfere with anybody else's right to do whatever they want to do. You know, that's the law of equal freedom, and that's fine. Rothbard then takes on the left and this idea of using the state to equalize all humanity, you know, essentially using coercion to realize their dreams of perfect equality. As I was thinking about this today, I was trying to imagine conditions that exist today, because I don't really think that, I mean, you hate to sort of set up fake scenarios, you know, as if there's all these leftists out there dreaming of, you know, some sort of utopian society of perfect equality of all income and opportunity. And yeah, that's not really true, right? I mean, nobody really believes that. So how does sort of leftist egalitarianism play itself out today? There's a sense in which maybe Obamacare is like samples of that, maybe a little bit, you know, this attempt to kind of have a universal solution that everybody has access to. We all have access to the same medical care. And we saw how that turned out, right? So that might have been motivated in part by sort of an egalitarian push. You know, we still have remnants of the income tax and the punishing taxes on things like, you know, inheritance that are certainly motivated by egalitarian drive. Rothbard, in his second introduction to the second edition of this book, particularly targets the sort of what people call nowadays social justice warriorism, that uses the state to bring about equal results. You know, there's a particularly troubling movement with regard to women's wages, which is actually began me a few years ago. I just thought, oh, there's no chance this thing is ever going to happen. But nowadays, it's actually, you know, a sort of a growing threat out there. You know, given that so many people are now campaigning for this, and it's, you know, it's like the central point of Hillary Clinton's campaign, actually. The idea that there's going to be equal wages for equal work for women. You know, the real calamity of these kind of policies, I'm not even sure it's a philosophical problem. I mean, Rothbard seems to identify this egalitarianism as being like a fundamental philosophical problem. Like anybody who thinks that there can be perfect equality is a dangerous criminal. I mean, it doesn't matter to me if people want there to be, high and equal wages for everybody. I mean, that's fine. Maybe it's inconsistent with what you can possibly ever observe in reality, but the real problem here is the means that people want to use to achieve it. In other words, it's not a troubling thing that Hillary Clinton wants women's wages to be higher, or that it bugs her that she has a perception that there's a great deal of discrimination out there against women. And I'm not prepared to argue that there's not. I mean, I don't even think it matters whether there is or there isn't. The question is, what are the right and wrong means for dealing with it? And it's just an incontrovertible fact that legislation that would mandate equal pay for equal work would be the worst calamity to be ever visited upon women workers since the advent of the capitalistic system. It would be a true disaster, disabling women's work opportunities across the board, cartelizing the market for a handful of women who might benefit from it, otherwise imposing mass glass ceilings on women workers across the board who, would be deliberately held down to lower status, lower positions, and never tested in higher ones, just because of the mandate that there be a perfect coordination between the title and the wage. I mean, this would, a system like this would in effect impose a form of central planning on the American economy like we've never seen before. There wouldn't be a single firm in America with probably, it depends on how this stuff would be implemented, probably over 15, over 20 employees, that wouldn't be subject to Department of Labor micromanagement of its wage system. And that would just be a calamity. Women would across the board be kept in lower positions so they could be paid equal pay for equal work. They would not be able to ascend up in a normal way, since normally the way you advance is that you take on more responsibility to test yourself before your wages are increased. That's the normal workplace measure. This kind of legislation doesn't understand anything about that, where wages come from, like at all. So these things, this stuff is extremely dangerous. It's extremely dangerous for women. It's extremely dangerous for freedom in general, and for prosperity, and for the well-functioning of economic life. And it always amazes me just how bad the left really is on matters of economics, so they could rally around this kind of stuff, no matter how many times it's been explained to them, or how much, I mean, the great enemy for women in the workplace has always been the state. It's always been the state and industrial cartels and labor unions. And wouldn't you know that here we are in 2015, you've got mainstream feminists rallying around the state, industrial cartels, and labor unions. So they don't understand. They don't understand what's going on. So this Rothbard really sort of reads them the riot act. Now, my favorite part of the essay now comes from I'm sorry, I was just looking at I was just looking at the chat here. Okay, my favorite part of the essay deals with this primitivism question, which I'm fascinated by, and which I think was relatively new when this essay came out, because Rothbard started sort of his dalliance with the left. I would say as early as the late 1950s, early 1960s, when the left was the so-called old left, right? And with the advent of the hippie movement, things really began to change. And irrationalism began to sort of creep into leftist ideology, and with it, a sort of primitivism that Rothbard began to discern emerging on within the left-wing ethos, which is fascinating because if you think about, Rothbard grew up in New York, right in Brooklyn, I guess, and all of his friends, all of his family, all their friends and their family, they were all communists, right? I mean, that's just sort of that world that Rothbard grew up in. But a particular kind of rationalistic communism that was not religious. It was presumably scientific. It believed in rationality. It believed in planning. It believed in smart people running everything. But this weird new kind of leftist theory came along in the late 1960s, particularly with Silent Spring. I think that was released in 1967, 68, something like that. And with environmentalism. And this new view that Marx would have completely rejected. Lenin would have had nothing to do with it. The old left, would have despised this kind of primitivist theory. But the idea that somehow industrial civilization corrupted our inner souls, and that consumerism. There's a Galbraith book that came out, in 1966, called The Affluent Society, which is bitching about the fact that, look, we're way too rich, we have way too much stuff. And it's funny because the old left used to say the good thing about socialism is that it would bring more stuff to people, as versus capitalism, which they thought was just exploiting the workers, and it's going to lead to monopolization and ever more deprivation for the working and middle class, which turns out to have been not utter rot. Nonetheless, the aspirations for material success were always there as part of the old left. So what Rothbard detected is that with the advent, with sort of environmentalism and the rise of sort of hippie theory on the new left, that there is a new kind of longing, an anti-consumerism, anti-industrialism, realizing that socialism could not achieve prosperity in the same way that capitalism did and does. We suddenly see socialism accommodating itself to the new reality and favoring deindustrialization, anti-consumerism, resenting materialism, and actually becoming, pro-poverty, as if, poverty is a higher state for us. We're being corrupted by how much we're consuming. The successes of capitalism are somehow corrupting our souls. And so we need policies that'll bring us greater poverty to save us. And this was very alarming to Rothbard. In fact, it was very alarming to, not just the libertarians of the time, but to members of the old left. They're like, I don't know what it is with this new attitude, but this isn't my view of the world. I favored socialism because I figured we could get more washing machines, more widely distributed, more books, more raincoats, better vacations and cooler stuff for everybody. Not because we want everybody to be scratching around the ground and turning their toilets into what are they called? I'm sorry, it's where you throw the trash into the thing or whatever. It turns out like a mulching pile or whatever. There's some word for this, but anyway, this is not the old left. This is something completely new, and this is unleashed on the world in the late 1960s, and it's been with us ever since. It's actually interesting. You can see a real break in the history of socialist thinking before and after this period. The socialists were always pro-materialism, pro-electricity, pro-industry. I just thought it could be, better achieved through central planning. After the late 1960s, you see this new primitivist strain, which has now gone absolutely mainstream. Almost everybody on the left has this kind of weird resentment against capitalism or against materialism in general, because it believes we have to cut back. And this is, I think, this primitivist strain. If I were going to try to say which is the most dangerous thing we face, is it egalitarianism, or is it from the left? Is it egalitarianism, Or is it the hatred of the division of labor? Is it the lack of understanding of property rights, or the lack of appreciation for economic freedom? I'd say the number one danger we face is the primitivist impulse, because that's the one that we see most expressed in the regulatory state. I mean, that's the thing that's destroying, basic functioning of our washing machines, our refrigerators, our ice makers, our toilets, which don't work anymore. That's making us default even back to like one-ply toilet paper, as if we're all in prison. That's making our plumbing in our houses not work anymore. That's making our clothes not clean. Imposing on us hot water heaters that you can't even hack to get warmer than tepid. I mean, it's actually a threat. That's taking away from us essential, insecticides, every day. So it's ever more difficult even to get an insecticide that can kill a bed bug or kill a chicken in the yard or kill anything, because nothing's available to us anymore. This is really essentially a war against the civilizing effects of capitalism, and a longing for, a state of nature, which, contrary to what the primitivists believe, is not so wonderful, as a matter of fact. I mean, nature is essentially dangerous, and our main role with regard to nature is to tame it so that we don't get eaten by bugs or animals or disease, essentially. So this primitivism, as Rothbard describes it, is essentially a kind of a wacky religion. Born probably of Rousseau, or Rousseau just represents, the best embodiment of it. I mean, you can look at primitivist thinking dating all the way back to, the 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries, with the rise of the followers of the prophet Mani, with the so-called Manichaeans. I mean, they're always with us, but we can never get rid of these people. But in any case, they've reemerged on the new left in the 1960s, and they're vexing us every day. The regulatory state is very much rallying around them, and this is why we can't get essential medicines anymore. It's why our lives are ever more diminished. And, hardly a year goes by where they don't do something else to ruin beautiful industrial creations like dishwashers, washing machines, washers, cars. We haven't really had any advance in essential car technology in 50 years. I mean, we have new bells and gizmos and backup lights and tracking devices and that kind of stuff, but the car itself is not as good now as it was decades ago. It just isn't. It's gotten worse. Especially in design, there's hideous now. Mainly because of the regulatory controls. We're just not seeing the level of innovation. Government ownership over the electrical grid, that's another problem. But anyway, it's a regulatory state sort of freezing everything in place and then actively making efforts to diminish the quality of our life. That worries me very, very much. I think it's a clear and present danger that the left presents. And one thing that's thrilling about reading this Rothbard essay is just the way he just loves modernity. He just celebrates technology. And here you see, the influence of Rand, just like coming through in its fullest way. And it's good to read this, because you realize just how much, that sort of Rand's vision of a mighty industrial civilization that's always on the march against nature, as a celebrating, the human mind and the use of reason in service of human life. This spirit is pervasive in this essay. That's something he definitely took from Rand and learned his lessons, very well. So, and then finally, the division of labor. And this is related to equality and primitivism. But the idea of cooperating with people, the idea of the division of labor is actually like, I think Don Boudreau pointed this out, some years ago. the critical, probably the most important discovery economics ever made. And, I don't think anybody's written about it as well as Adam Smith in Wealth of Nations. Adam Smith was a popularizer of already known theories, but he did a great job of it. He was, an excellent thinker in his own right, of course. But the idea of the division of labor itself is just a little bit counterintuitive. It's that we can make more stuff working together, regardless of our individual talents, than we can make, apart. As in, no matter how talented we have to be, we have to rely on other people. And the more we can allocate tasks and specialize and cooperate one with another and trade, the more prosperous we'll be. This is the basis of prosperity. It's division of labor. The left has never really understood this, and that's absolutely true. I mean, it's actually amazing, to read Marx and Lenin on this topic. No conception whatsoever of the division of labor. I mean, it's just not part of it, not part of the way they thought. Why they missed it, I mean, there's no sense in going into it, but essentially they had a confused value theory. I mean, that was the fundamental problem all along. In any case, so this essay, represents a little bit of Rothbard's sort of declaration of independence from the left, or maybe you could see it as his love letter to his friends on the left, written in hopes that they could fix their problems of misunderstandings about social theory and political theory and economic theory, rectify them, and hold on, to the passion against conscription, the passion against war, the love of marginal populations, their loathing of police abuse. All these things were very important to Rothbard, but he couldn't abide the egalitarianism, the primitivism, and the lack of understanding of economics that was, this part of the left then, that's part of the left now. Now his new the newest version, probably, I don't know if it's the one we offer on Liberty.me or not, but he wrote I think a new introduction to this that came out in the 1990s maybe, in which he specifically narrows in on the egalitarianism point, which I mean, it's interesting. His introduction is good and interesting, but also very much part of the times, right? I think probably if you were around now, we'd have to say something different, because there's, you've got primitivism on the right, especially among, well, you've got all the same problems on the left as you have on the right. It's the old debate, and there's probably not a month that goes by where I don't engage in this debate with somebody. Of course, it's a subject all libertarians love to discuss. Which is the greater threat, the left or the right? And we all have our different views on that. So it's something we can discuss all night, right? We love it. I've long thought that the right represents a much more fundamental danger to human liberty than the left, just because I think the right's more effective than the left. And there's always line and wait, That's my own perspective, but I had a big argument, not argument, but a discussion today with Justin Raimondo, has exactly the opposite view. He sees the right as fundamentally marginalized, and the left is, the ruling class. Because these are fun discussions. There's always truth in both points of view, but they're fun. And I think whichever one you consider to be the greater threat, in a lot of ways determines your outlook on day-to-day political affairs. For example, I noticed that libertarian opinion on this court decision recently, the gay marriage, same-sex marriage court decision, was split, half-half, I would say. And it really comes down to what you think is a greater threat. I mean, those people who think that their religious right and their theocratic longings for a kind of a church-state imposition of traditionalist morality, that if that's the greater threat, this court decision represents a wonderful victory for liberty. On the other hand, if you think that the left's use of government power to reconstruct organic institutions like, the family, and constantly destabilize everyone with, special rights, made up out of whole cloth and imposed by a judiciary. You think that's a bigger threat? Well, then this decision was a disaster, and just so this is the way people confirm their worldviews, based on certain priors. My own position is both and, actually. I think both positions have a lot of truth to them. But Rothbard's essay does give you a chance to sort of reflect on this question: what is the greater threat, the right or the left? I'm not sure that his essay answers that, though it's structured as a kind of a lesson to the left. It's like, let's deal with a little bit of reality here, my friends. And this is this is a period where he was still very active with him. He didn't really sort of bail out on the new left until somewhere in the late 1970s, I would say. Of course, this is also the period when he was trying to get involved with the Libertarian Party. But anyway, I tell the story, the autobiography of Rothbard's writings, because I think it's important to understand, where he was and what he was thinking about at the time he writes these things. It's not really possible to look at an essay, purely in the abstract. You have to reflect something on what was the nature of the times in which it was written, what was the thinking of the man who wrote it. Okay, let me go over here to chat and see. Okay, I'm going to see if we got any questions I need to answer. It looks like you're all having a nice, good discussion here, so there's no sense for me to jump in here. I do have a piece coming out. Let me just mention a couple of things. So I just threw up on Liberty.me a piece today about this extremely important issue of the bailouts and not the bank closings in Greece. They're declaring a bank holiday tomorrow, so you won't be able to go to the banks and get your money. That's why we've seen Bitcoin on the move. I was over at PorcFest and noticing the price of Bitcoin was experienced a lot of upward pressure. So I wondered what that was about, and then sure enough, got a call today from Russia Today, in which they were talking about the Greek situation, and then it turns out to be the headline of all the financial news all over the world. What it's going to lead to, I don't know, but I do think it's interesting that Bitcoin is being used as a kind of safe haven, more so than gold, because we've seen no movement in gold price whatsoever, even though the refusal of the European community to bail out Greece once again has been building for weeks now. Gold's not moved at all. Bitcoin, you see the upward pressure. So take note, my friends, it's the age of cryptocurrency. The age of gold is over, and I hope we can look to the end of the age of national currencies too. What else do I want to tell you? I went to Voice and Exit. In addition, I spoke at the Acton University. I also went to Voice and Exit, which is a beautiful event in Austin, Texas. And it was just wonderful. I really enjoyed speaking there. I struggled so hard in my speech because I was just concerned that I was trying to present cryptocurrency in a kind of a congealed, compressed way, 12 minutes. And I think I did it. I think I did. Maybe I didn't do the perfect job, but I did about as well as I probably could have on my first attempt at the new kind of metaphorical thinking on the topic. But I had a fascinating thing happen to me. So I was giving a seminar afterwards with my old friend Alex Tabarrok, and it was just and also Jim Epstein, who's a young movie producer at Reason Magazine. My old friend Alex and I hadn't been together in God so long, 20 years, 25 years, I don't know. He's a wonderful man. And we were given a seminar. I had my computer there with me, and then I got up to give my seminar or whatever. Some workers came and cleaned up the chairs. One of the workers took my bag, and that made me not happy. But I went that night to Best Buy. got a new MacBook Air, signed in, immediately went over to find my MacBook or whatever, and programmed the machine that had been stolen to erase all data when opened, to sound an alarm, and to deliver a note that said, call this number immediately, call or text this number immediately if you have this computer, no questions asked. So, and I was kind of sad because like a full day or a day and a half went by, and suddenly I was sitting there, and then all my devices just began to like explode, so my phone, my iPad, my new MacBook Air, everybody's screaming at me, oh my God, your computer's been found. And then sure enough, I got, within a few minutes, a text from a very nice woman who was saying, I saw that I'm supposed to call this number. I didn't, this was not an attempt to steal this. When my husband brought it home, I said to my son, this is something that we must do the right thing and return this to its proper owner, and so on, right? So it clearly was an attempt to sort of swipe my computer, but thanks to technology, it created this kind of explosive environment in which, I can't even imagine what it must have been like for these nice people to have opened my computer and had it just like start screaming at them and blow up and everything. But anyway, so I was able to send somebody over there and sent my computer back. So it was very exciting. I was really happy about that. So those are my two little stories. But Acting University was amazing. We had about 2,000 people there. Voice and Exit was wonderful. I think there might have been, 350, 400 people there. I don't know. It was a wonderful event. And then off to PorcFest, which I think PorcFest is, the great event, essentially, in the world of Liberty today. I just can't imagine anything better. It's just a delight. We gave somebody like 6 or 7 talks there, so it was really fantastic. The next stop is Freedom Fest. I hope to see you all there. Thank you for hanging out with me tonight. I'm going to check chat one more time before we... Yeah, exactly. That's a good point. I didn't have to call the police. Yeah, amazing. Anti-theft controls. It worked. Well, all the best to you, and I hope to see you next week. I don't see any reason why I won't be here with you. So I look forward to seeing you then. And let's have a good week. Have a look at my piece on Greece. I've got a piece coming out, I hope tomorrow, on fee.org on, it's on this issue of gay discrimination for or against gays. Okay, so we got this court ruling which you can agree or disagree with, but nonetheless, sort of a win for liberty at some level, in some way. Just only in the sense that people have greater freedom association. So immediately, 2 days later, the New York Times has an article about gay leaders are now taking the next step, which is to ban discrimination in housing and employment, against gays. Okay, so we go from free association to taking away freedom. This is the way it works, bouncing from one to the other. And what I attempt to do in this article, which I think will be published by Fee probably tomorrow, is give a consequentialist sort of argument. Not just that, okay, we have property rights, we have freedom of association, people have a right to discriminate if they want to, all that is true. The problem is that, apparently that argument doesn't persuade anybody, or it doesn't matter anymore. So I tried to explain why we need freedom of discrimination to be active and alive, so that the consumers who want to base their purchasing decisions based on their own personal values can have choices and see, okay, here's a business that hires gays, that gives same-sex couples health care that whatever is gay friendly, and you want to support that, then you can. Or if another company, a corporation, does not believe in that, that's their core values, then you can support them. And these culture wars, as we call them, should be worked out in the commercial marketplace, not through politics. And this is actually the peaceful way to evolve as a society. But that the right to discriminate is essential to all sides, because it provides information that you really absolutely need. I gave a specific example in my own case. I mean, and I'll let you read the article, but I wanted to bring a friend in from Shanghai to stay at an Airbnb, and the person I contacted was very suspicious. He didn't like the fact that my friend was from Shanghai, and he asked like a lot of questions about his ethnicity, his religion, his place of origin, and so on. Questions I found just frankly annoying. So I canceled my reservation, or canceled my request there, and took what was actually a very high dollar contract for a week-long stay to a person down the street who immediately picked it up and won. Well, I guess my point is that I'm not unhappy about the guy who discriminated against my friend because he was from Shanghai. That's his right. It's his home. He can do what he wants. But I can also do what I want as a consumer, and I wanted to reward the other person for jumping at the chance to take my friend in. Well, the way that played out, you have to have the right to discriminate. Otherwise, I'm not using my dollars well, and the truth about people's values and their outlook on life is not revealed in a way that informs me as a consumer about my best possible spending decisions. So this is why I think that non-discrimination law is essentially very, very bad for everyone. Whether you consider yourself, an advocate of the gay rights cause or not. What we need is honesty and truth-telling in commercial relations, not law that covers covers up all human motivations and makes everybody look the same. I think that's actually a very dangerous policy. So I argued this at some length. Anyway, thank you so much for joining me tonight, and I look forward to seeing you next week. We have so many new articles on Liberty.me. Stick with it and read them all, comment on it. Thank you for being part of our brilliant community, and we will talk to you soon enough. All the best. Bye-bye.